Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Garrison Institute's live interactive webinar. Today, our guest is Michelle Maldonado. Michelle Maldonado is the founder of Usencia, a firm dedicated to human flourishing and mindful business transformation. She is a former attorney turned business leader and is an internationally certified mindfulness and emotional intelligence teacher and practitioner. Michelle's work focuses on leadership development at the pivotal intersection of mindfulness, unconscious bias, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and compassion, nestled on a foundation of neuroscience and research. She serves as senior faculty for 1440's Multi-Universities Leadership Center, Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence Coaching Certification Program, and Bill George's True North Leadership Program. Michelle has been recognized as one of the 12 powerful women in the mindfulness movement, Women of the Year, and a top corporate leader, with her work featured in The Mindful Leader, the DQ Institute, in association with the World Economic Forum, Mindful Magazine, and Thrive Global. She is a graduate of Barnard College and the George Washington University of School of Law. Before we begin today's session, I'll go over a few logistical items about our gathering. We're on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video are turned off. So for the time being, you'll see myself and then you'll see Michelle. For anyone unable to attend live, we are recording these sessions and you'll have an opportunity to view the recordings as well as a schedule of our upcoming programs at garrisoninstitute.org. We offer these sessions free of charge and as a goodwill gesture to support our community during these times of heightened uncertainty, we would welcome donations of any amount in order to help us continue to offer these sessions. Thank you. We're on for an hour today and we'll respond to as many finally, we'll have time for Q&A toward the end of this webinar. You can post your questions along the bottom panel of your screen by hovering your arrow over the Q&A button. We're on for an hour today and we'll respond to as many questions as we can. Please forgive us if we're unable to get to your question. And thank you again, Michelle, for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Amy. And hello, everyone. So glad to be here with you today and really sort of appreciating just the pause and the opportunity to be here together and take a break from what I often call all the crazy that's happening in these fluid, challenging, but also really transformational and opportunistic times for many of us. For all of us, actually. So I'm going to share my screen and let's start talking about what it is that we're going to do during our time together. And as Amy mentioned, we'll walk through a couple of concepts and share a little bit of information. And we're going to do a meditation practice towards the end to close our session, right before we leave the last quarter, about 15 minutes for open Q&A. For you all to share some thoughts and other questions that you might have. Now, during our time together, we're going to look at mindful leadership and sort of how do we lead awake in these COVID times and these times of social unrest and just times of challenge and times of opportunity. And we're going to look at this time and this way of being that informs our way of leading through three different sort of lenses or perspectives. And the first is our bodies, understanding the emotions, how they show up, our nervous system, how all of these things start to inform and influence our decision-making and behavior, which of course leads then to the quality and nature of our presence. Then looking at our filters, or another way of saying that is our minds. How do we start to pay attention to the mental narratives, to how the brain forms perception. And then taking that information from what happens in the body, what happens in the mind, pulling it forward into how those things begin to shape our relationship and interactions with others. Now, before we dig in too deeply, I just want to say that's how we're going to approach today's conversation. And today is a conversation and exploration that is an invitation to think about things perhaps a little differently, or perhaps think more deeply about things that are already on your heart and mind. Before we do that, though, I'd like to give us about maybe a 60-second, I'm thinking, sort of moment to arrive. I don't know what you all had prior to arriving here today on your plates, but I imagine that there was a lot to shuffle to be able to create this space and this pause for ourselves. So I'd love to take this opportunity to just give us a moment to arrive. And the way we'll do that is by taking 60 seconds to just find a comfortable way to sit in your chair, perhaps allowing your feet to be flat on the floor, your spine erect and kind of stretching upwards so that your spine feels like a majestic mountain, but allowing the belly to be soft. If you like, you can even close your eyes or instead perhaps cast them in a softened downward gaze. And taking 3 comfortable breaths in and out, allowing the air to enter the nostrils as it travels down the throat, into the lungs and belly. Exhaling, allowing for more tension and centeredness to enter. Taking another breath in and out as you allow the body to settle, the breath to settle, and the mind to settle. Whatever thoughts, whatever things we have to do, see if you can gather them up and imagine placing them into a small suitcase and placing that suitcase outside of your door. Those things will be there for you when and if you'd like to pick them up later. Setting an intention for this next hour to just simply be here, to be fully present, giving yourself the gift of this pause. Taking another deep breath in and out, feeling your feet on the floors, your body's in the chair. And if your eyes are closed, inviting you to open them up, bringing your attention back to the virtual room. All right. Okay. Well, this is really where the welcome really begins. Now that we're all finally here, because sometimes we could physically be someplace and our minds and thoughts are somewhere else. And that moment to arrive helps us to gather. So that's a first takeaway practice, that a moment to arrive. We did that for about 2 minutes. You can do that for 3 breaths. You could do that for 1 minute. You can do it for 1 breath. And I offer this for you to think about how these tools can be used in the work environment as well as the personal. A moment to arrive can be a helpful transition tool between meetings, or even at the beginning of a meeting, to allow yourself to be fully present. Now, with that, what I'd like to do is offer another lens. We talked about the body, the filters, and the relationships. But here's another lens that I'd love for us to hold as we walk through our conversation today that is represented by this. What you see on the screen is, how do we as leaders be the bridge and not the fence? And here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes we think about how things are inequitable and how there's so much inequality. And not everybody has equal access, not everybody has equal opportunity, and not everybody is equally, properly, and fully resourced. That is the world we live in, that is inside and operating within ecosystems and systems and frameworks that were built to honor and benefit a few over the many. Our response to that over the years has been our demand for equality. Now, equality, as the word suggests, is to make things equal. And you can see in this illustration that just making things equal actually doesn't give people access. It doesn't create equal opportunity. So then we start to think about, well, then we really need to think in terms of equity. Now that's where things start to shift. We have people properly resourced, and perhaps then they're better able to navigate a system. Now I say this system, and it's represented in these sort of little vignettes by the fence. The fence gets in the way. The fence either supports or challenges or obstructs many of us in many ways. And I don't say a system that's broken, because in fact, I think the system was created intentionally the way it is. But as we evolve as humans, as leaders, we begin to see the system doesn't serve. And so now we say the system is broken. But the system was designed intentionally to work as it does. And so what we're really called to do to create belonging is to remove that system. And so this is the lens that I'm inviting us to explore our concepts today and our topics as we move into how do we lead awake at work. Now, before we do that, one of the things that's important for us to think about is how emotions and other things show up in the body. So let's move into that first realm of bodies, our bodies. Now, the interesting thing about our bodies is that it gives us so much data. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily cognitive awareness. I'm talking about physiological sensations in the body that give us data. And here's what we know from research is that even though emotions are very complex, and so whether you take some earlier research, such as a very well-known research study out of Finland that maps our emotions to the body, or you look more at the emerging work of Lisa Feldman Barrett that looks at the complex circuitry of emotions and how they arise, how they're made, and how they influence what we do, there are some really key things that we need to understand. The first is that it is easy for us to understand this first piece of that emotions do have a feeling in the body. Now, we may not be very experienced in noticing sensations in the body, so don't be overly concerned if I invite you to tap in to sense something in the body and you're like, I don't feel anything there. Now, sometimes it's because truly there is nothing there. And sometimes it's just simply because we haven't learned how to exercise that muscle of learning how to tune in to what is present in the body. So with an earlier study that was done out of Finland, I'm going to sort of explain that one to you briefly. In there, they did a cross-generational, cross-sectional, cross-cultural, and cross-gender study and invited people to write on body silhouettes where they experienced sensations in the body when they were sort of experiencing certain emotions. The challenge that we're seeing with some newer research is saying that sometimes if you tell me, look at this picture, and you interpret that as anger, and I ask you, where do you feel that in your body? You say, oh, I feel anger in my chest, or I feel heat in my head. But somebody else looks at that picture and they says, oh, that looks like concentration. Where does that sit? So what we know is that sometimes the interpretation of the emotions we think we're witnessing might be slightly off. But here's where we can turn it to our advantage. If we know that for ourselves, the way we define emotions, a particular set of emotions like anger, frustration, love, joy, celebration, feeling isolated, depressed, if we can identify when we experience those emotions, how they show up in our own personal bodies, the rest doesn't really matter. whether you're following old research or news research. So one of the things I'd like to invite people to do is to really tune in when you're feeling a certain situation or experience to see, check in, do a body scan and see where is that showing up in my body. So I'll give you an example. If you just pause for a moment and you bring to mind somebody you love, just even if in this moment you just close your eyes and you think about, oh, maybe even placing your hand on your heart or your heart center in the middle of your chest. And you say, this person, I just would move heaven and earth for them. The thought of them, the sight of them, the sound of their voice makes me smile. Someone who you want the best for, who you want to see succeed and be happy and healthy in life and always have a felt sense of feeling heard, valued, and seen. Now, when I ask you to bring someone to mind that you love, take a moment to see if you also notice any sensations in the body or feelings in the body. When you experience love, what are the accompanying physical sensations for you? And these may be similar or different to others. What's most important is that you understand how it shows up for you. Taking a moment to just anchor that knowing. And if you don't sense any feelings or movement in the body, that's okay too. Note that it's neutrality, and that's okay. The second step is always sort of accompanying, once you know that physiological sensation, what's the mental narrative or what's the cognitive companion to that? And so just checking in there. So when you feel love, there might be words that or phrases that come to mind for you, like sweetness or tender or I adore you or whatever it is. So when you can map those two things together, you begin to then create a really skillful way to check in periodically throughout the day. So if you know after creating your mental map and your body map that you tend to hold things in different places in your body, when you're in a meeting, when you're in a conversation, when you're celebrating, planning, strategizing as a leader, you can take a moment and say, let me check in real quick. Okay, I see my shoulders are doing that thing again that they do. I'm going to take a breath. And so this is one way that we as leaders can use the information that is readily available to us. Now, here's why we want to really start there. And the reason is because the emotions, when they show up, oftentimes start to percolate and do things that influence our decision-making and behavior at most, and at minimum, our perceptions of what's going on. So there is a quick study I want to tell you of, this Iowa gambling study, where they gave participants 4 decks of cards. And in the decks of cards, there were 2 red and 2 blue. And the red deck, they didn't tell the people in the experiment were rigged. You couldn't really win very much with them, that you really wanted to use the blue decks and to maximize your winnings. And so they gave them the decks of cards and they said, please play this game, play it to the best of your ability and maximize your winnings. At about 50 cards in, they started to have a hunch that something was up, something was a little fishy. They weren't really sure what it was. It might have something to do with those red cards, but not really sure. And it wasn't until 80 cards in that they had full cognitive awareness that the red decks were rigged. Now that was part 1. Okay, it took people on average about 80 cards to figure out that the blue cards were the ones they wanted to use. The second part of that experiment was that they attached electrodes to the palms of the participants' hands. Now, many of us know that the sweat glands in our bodies tend to respond to heat. So that's why we perspire when we're hot. All the sweat glands in our bodies respond to temperature, not just heat, but temperature, except for the ones in the palms of our hands. Those respond to stress. So here's what they noticed, that on average, as participants began to reach for the red deck, on average at about 10 cards in, they start to reach and then they divert and pick the blue decks. Now think about that for a moment. 10 cards in, the body already started registering information. So not only were they reaching for the red and shifting to actually picking up the blue, the palms were beginning to sweat at about 10 cards in. That is 40 cards before full cognitive awareness. 70 cards before full cognitive awareness and 40 cards before a hunch. So what that tells us is that the body is already operating in full motion. And when it gets the information, it starts to work on our behavior, our decision-making, and our perceptions. So this can be very interesting for us. And one of the ways that we have to think about this is how then does that begin to affect us as leaders? So let's take a moment to think about this, but first think about it in the context of our bodies and our nervous systems. So if all this is happening, you can imagine that our nervous system is getting extremely activated in this time. And I call it a nervous system because sometimes we just feel nervous, we feel anxious. But there are actually multiple parts to our nervous systems. And the one that I want to talk about is our autonomic nervous system. And our autonomic nervous system is the part of the body that controls the involuntary movements of our systems. And so think about the things that we don't have to think about. Thankfully, they're just taken care of for us, like breathing, like our heart beating, and digestion, or the contraction of our muscles when we need to reach for something or pull in. Thankfully, those just happen naturally without us even having to take conscious awareness of it. Now, part of the autonomic nervous system is another subset called the sympathetic nervous system. This is the part that most of us are really aware of. It's the part where we always talk about this sort of amygdala hijack, and we fight, flight, or freeze when a threat is detected. It is necessarily part of our limbic system where the amygdala sits, which is part of the oldest, it's connected to that, which is part of the oldest part of our brains that is built and designed to scan for threat. It's what has kept us alive for eons and is so critically important for us. But it's not the only thing. Without proper regulation and interaction with other parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive reasoning and functioning, which helps us tremendously in the leadership capacity, then sometimes we can hold ourselves stuck in this fight, flight, or freeze state. Now, the sympathetic nervous system also beautifully maintains homeostasis in the body, helping to keep things kind of flowing in harmony and balance, which, as you can imagine, is equally important as well. Now, here's the second part of the autonomic nervous system, and that is the parasympathetic nervous system. And here's where we start to look at the intersection of what's happening in the body with a practice of mindfulness, with a state of being that then informs our way of leading and doing. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that activates or is responsible for our rest and digest, or our restoration and healing functions. That's part of what it does. It helps restore state of calm to the body. Now this, while it does help us relax, it doesn't mean that when we activate this in times of crisis or challenge or stress, that we're going to all of a sudden want to relax and go to sleep. Many of us who have practiced mindfulness for some time realize that yes, mindfulness can be a way to help us relax, but oftentimes when we're in stressful and challenging and heightened sort of crisis situations, it's a way for us to create clarity and calm of mind to allow the body to do what it needs to do best. And in this way, the breath helps us to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. It's one of the reasons why in mindfulness we often use the breath. But sometimes the breath, and I just shared this little piece, that sometimes the breath can be a little challenging because we may hold trauma in our bodies. We may have unresolved trauma or active trauma, and just bringing full attention to the body or the breath can actually exacerbate the trauma without proper supports and guidance by trained clinical professionals, for example. But sometimes we can use other objects of our attention in mindfulness meditation, for example, to help us activate the parasympathetic nervous system as we breathe. So that could be a spot, like a visual, like a spot on the floor or the knee, or it could be a sound, like the hum of a fan or air conditioning unit, or something that's sort of consistent and humming in the background as we breathe. And that breath, that slow in breath and that slow out breath, helps us to acknowledge and sort of activate the parasympathetic nervous system. But not that alone, which is what makes it so wonderful and dynamic. There's another piece that's integrated with the parasympathetic nervous system, and that is the vagus nerve. And despite how it sounds, it has nothing to do with vagus. It has everything to do with building our capacity and cultivating our capacity to be the flagpole instead of the flag in the storm, to be the eye of the hurricane where there is the most calm, as opposed to all the wind and clouds and rain whipping around in the midst of it. Now, the vagus nerve, also, despite the fact that it is singular in name, it actually is a bundle of nerves. And if you imagine you place your hand on the back of your neck, place it on your heart, then your belly, and then even further, that cranial nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body, and it connects the brainstem to the brain, and it goes all the way down to our colon, and it mixes and touches organs in between. So it ultimately creates the mind-body connection as it travels through and traverses through the body from top to bottom. And this is important because when we activate this and we create a higher vagal tone, is what it's called, when we have this in relationship to the parasympathetic nervous system, it becomes really powerful. Mindfulness becomes a very powerful tool, not just in leadership, but in life, to help us find our centered place. So with that, thinking about emotions showing up in the body, trauma that's already there, and trauma doesn't have to be something from a war-torn nation. Trauma is relative. So you may have things that have happened in your life experience outside of work, or things that have happened inside of work that for you sit in the body as trauma or traumatic experiences. And over again, sort of feeling that without proper processing can really stress the nervous system. So one way to be kind to ourselves as leaders and as human beings is to work with the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve to help us do that. So that's the body. Now, if that is how the body works, I want to talk a little bit about the brain. What's happening with the brain? And I love this sort of this thing of threes of paradox, prediction, and perception. Here's the thing that's really interesting about the brain is that the brain is a predicting organ, and we often have all of our next few moments, our future moments, are predicted a little bit in the past. So every few moments, our brain is predicting the next few moments future for us. So we end up living moment by moment from a brain standpoint. Now, what's interesting about that is that our predictions are pulled, the data is pulled from past life experience. So if we think about it, if our sort of life experience is narrow, or we have a huge set of challenging or upsetting or uncomfortable interactions with a person or a group of people, our predictions for what happens in the future with that person or those people are going to be pulled from that. And so we often sort of create this cycle of living the future we expect. Now, the challenge with that in current times, well, there's always a challenge with that when there's such limited information that we're pulling from, is that we also live in a time of paradox. And the paradox is that we are experiencing things, particularly now with what's going on around the world and specifically in the US, where paradox is happening, and that is things that don't quite make sense, that don't seem rational, that may not seem like they align with our definitions of common sense. So the brain is trying to recalibrate and make sense of that as it forms its predictions, which all collectively form our perceptions. So if in those perceptions, context matters. So when we come into the workplace awake, our perceptions, those filters of the body and then of the brain, are starting to inform and influence and impact our decisions as leaders, our behavior as leaders, and how we speak to others, how we perceive them, and their value and place in that ecosystem. So when we do that, we have to be very aware of what that impact is. And as we think about impact in the space of work, there are some things we can do to help cultivate our capacity to create spaces of safety. And one of them is looking at things like psychological safety. How do we create that? And one of the things we know from our research and from anecdotally, if you feel that there is compassion and empathy and trust, you can create what's called psychological safety. Psychological safety doesn't mean that the other things that are important to team cohesion and performance aren't present. What it simply means is that it can be the glue that helps it be sustainable, high performing, and impactful, because it necessarily requires us to do our inside work first to be able to show up as healthy, productive members of our community. And in this case, it's the community of work. And then what we know is that the psychological safety based on sort of compassion and empathy is important, because that then also fuels our trust. And trust is so important in the workplace as leaders, as mindful leaders, because we know what it looks like when we don't have it. And we know what it feels like when we don't have it. There's often conversations around talking about culture. Oh, that culture at that place is awful. I had to leave because the culture was bad. Here's the thing, we interchange these two words all the time, culture and climate. Culture is what happens, right? It's the norms. It's how people behave. It's the lived values and behaviors, not the plaque on the wall. It's the lived ones that happen every day. Climate is how we feel when we enter that culture. And when we don't feel aligned, and we as leaders don't create the trust and the safety and the environments to be supported for people to take risk, to ask for help, to not be afraid to make a mistake, to recover when they do, all of that is something that we as leaders are called to cultivate. When we don't have it, it can make us feel uncomfortable as part of the climate equation of culture and climate. And here's why it's important. Because in these days when we are really transforming, we're not just changing, we are transforming the way the world of work is done. We're transforming our systems and ecosystems, and courage is required. And there's lots of vulnerability in the rise in cultivating the conditions for us to be courageous. Firstly, the courage courage is required to act when we have doubts and fears about the consequences. And even today, that courage has elevated even more to moral courage, which is different. Moral courage is the courage to take action for moral reasons, despite the risk of adverse consequences. So you can see the nuance different. And as leaders who are mindful and fully present, we're being asked to help create the conditions for both types of courage to be present so that we can create communities of belonging and unity. We're called to do this, but we can't do this without first fully doing our own inner work. In fact, there's a quote by John Mackey, who he stated this in an interview years ago, and he said, as leaders, we're required to do our own work, to work on ourselves, to better ourselves. And if we don't, we're holding our organizations back. Now, I believe that to be true in the organizational context, but actually bigger and broader, and more importantly than that, I believe it to be true in life. We're holding ourselves back. We hold our families back. We hold back the richness of living and connecting and loving and creating together when we don't do our own work. So with that, what I'd love to do is just give a quick opportunity for us to do a meditation practice called grace. As leaders, even when I was in an organization leading people, if I say the word grace, there's something that I feel inside myself that gives myself permission to be kind to myself. But it also is an invitation for me to extend grace to others. Now, many of you may know grace, the practice that's very popular these days, that Roshi Joan Halifax has used, and others have made it popularized in academic and teaching sessions and others. But it is really useful in all kinds of contexts. So before we get into Q&A, I want to take us through a meditation practice of grace. So with that, let's begin and find again a comfortable way to position the body so that you are both relaxed and alert. Perhaps again closing your eyes or instead casting in a gentle, softened downward gaze. And taking a few deep breaths in and out as we transition from listening to content to feeling content. Now with grace, I'm going to invite us to look at the first letter of the word grace, G. Gathering our attention. So let us gather our attention to be fully here in this practice, in this moment. Perhaps anchoring yourself into the body and really feeling your feet on the floor to acknowledge your full presence. And next, in the grace practice, the letter R, recalling intention. And for this practice of grace, the intention can simply be to learn and experience grace, to plant the seeds for how to extend and practice grace at work, at home, at play. And now that you've recalled your intention, your attention, let's then move to attuning. Attune yourself to yourself, and then we'll attune to others. And in grace, what this simply means is to check in with ourselves, taking a moment to perhaps check into the body, noticing what might be present, what you might feel. What sensations might be showing up in the body in this moment and where? Taking a moment to attune to the body. Continuing to breathe naturally in and out as you notice what might be present in the body. And taking a moment to pause and shifting your attention to the quality and nature of your thoughts in this moment. Perhaps you can just simply name them and let them go. Give them a word. Perhaps it's curious, or maybe tired, interested, or maybe even bored. Whatever the nature and quality of your thoughts are in this moment, just attuning yourself to those as well. And now inviting you to just bring your attention back to your breath. When we do grace more broadly, the other part of attuning is to attune to others. So when you practice this, perhaps at work, or even as a dedicated forum in your meditation, bringing your attention to how you are experiencing and perceiving and connecting to others is a companion component to attuning. Next, we will move to the letter C, considering what will serve. In this moment, what serves you and supports you? Many times it is asking the question of considering what will support the best outcome, the highest outcome. In this practice, perhaps you can consider what pieces of leading awake you'd like to lean into. Perhaps it's reflecting on your perceptions, or maybe even learning to check in and leverage the data that the body provides us so that we show up more skillfully and make more informed decision making as leaders. Consider just for a moment what pieces would best support you in leading awake. And finally, moving to the letter E of grace, this ending or ethical enactment. What's perhaps one action you could take to act upon what you've considered, what you've attuned to? What is that one thing? We don't need to boil the ocean, and perhaps for you there is more than one thing, but where would you like to begin? Where is your first place to start? Taking a moment to consider that now. And together, let's go ahead and take another comfortable breath in and out. As we feel our feet on the floor and our bodies in the chair. And if your eyes are closed, beginning to open them, awakening your awareness and bringing it back to the virtual room. As we think about how we lead awake, there are so many things that are happening in the body and in the brain that influence the nature and quality of our presence and the ripples of our actions. So mindfulness as the foundation is so critically important to enabling our capacity to lead awake. And the other thing that's a companion to that, of course, as you know, is compassion. And I want to end on this quote by Paul Gilbert, who's the founder of the Compassionate Mind Foundation, to really illustrate how powerful compassion is. Compassion is one of the most important declarations of strength and courage known to humanity. It's difficult and powerful while also being infectious and influential, and is a universally recognized motivation that has the ability to change the world. And when we change the world, because we start with ourselves, it means we ripple out, we cascade, we change our families, we change our communities, we change our places of work, we change our nation, we change the world. So with that, I want to thank you and turn it over and open it up to questions or comments that anyone might have at this time.
Michelle, we have a question from Denise. She wrote some context, which I'll read. It's a little long. So Denise says, I recently read the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977 and have also been exploring the concepts of ecofeminism. The Combahee Statement summarizes, we realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. With our current reality, it seems like these toxic systems are just beginning to be acknowledged, and that their breakdown could be a reality someday. I am nervous, though, that these systems are just going to be remanufactured again to trick us. So Denise's question is, how do we help others do their own work, just to acknowledge these systems are at play? I can see many people getting lost or caught up with how to apply the information they take in onto themselves. I want others to see that the one coming forward in any situation is not a threat, but as an alert that there is a toxic systems at work to harm people.
Yeah, thank you, Denise, for that question. Thank you, Amy, for reading that. And, this is really, really complex. And here's the thing, there are multiple ways to sort of respond to this. It's so multi-layered. The first part is when we talk about leading awake and we ask people to create these ecosystems of belonging and unity where everyone thrives and flourishes, we are necessarily talking about transforming what's present, not fixing, not changing, but transforming and elevating. That sort of maps to how we as humanity, our sort of higher consciousness, our awakening of what is truth in our collective reality and where the pieces fit and where we all fit together. So there is great toxicity in these systems that you have shared, but the toxicity isn't just because it's capitalism, imperialism, or patriarchy. It is an over-indexing on one side of the spectrum. So one of the things that I like to talk about with people often is we have to find a way to bring in femininity sort of the feminine, the power of the feminine in a way that is equal to the power of the masculine. This has nothing to do with our gender or sex. This has to do with the energy that sits in all of us. We all hold masculine energy. We all hold feminine energy. And where we have over-indexed in society and humanity is on the masculinity. And so what we're beginning to see with this awakening is that there are this infusion so that we're meeting and moving on the spectrum closer to the center. Now, in that shift, there are many people who will fear losing power. They fear the shift means they lose something. And in many senses, there is a power loss, but it's really a power shift and a power harmonizing and balancing. And in order to broker those conversations, to create invitations and open doors to have them, one of the things we have to do, those of us who are in the places where we're trying to have these conversations and cultivate these insights, is to show up in non-judgmental roles. We can dislike vehemently the way our systems in a particular country or community or the laws are inequitably applied to different population sets. But when we come to the table to try and resolve it, we have to do it in a way that's an invitation for hard conversation. So I'll give you an example. And sometimes when I do my work, I'm not a diversity and equity inclusion specialist, but I can't help but do my work with a diversity, equity, sort of inclusion and belonging lens. I think that when we ask ourselves to do our inner work, we must look at that lens that we've created and what's that filter that's impacting how we're showing up and the discomfort we feel in our bodies. And in one scenario where I was having a conversation, a gentleman who was very well known in some of these spaces said, "That's fine, women can get all the power they want, I'm just not giving up any." And so many times we feel like we're rubbing up against a door or a wall or a ceiling. But the other thing we have to keep in mind is the generation, the Gen Z and the millennials who are arriving new to this game and this conversation are extremely active and extremely clear and intentional about the world they want to create. So aligning and allying with those generations as well to help create a new reality is critically important. And when you notice people getting upset or uncomfortable about having these conversations, remember that we always have to meet people where they're at. Even in times of urgency, while we're showing and leading the way through modeling and information, we cannot expect the switch to be turned on overnight when it took decades for that person as an embodied sort of adult human being. It took many years, many life experiences, many crucibles, many things that formed who they are today. So if we can do our work to help meet where they are today, and when you meet somebody knowing who you are, it's a very different kind of dialogue. It doesn't mean that it's not intense, and it doesn't mean it's not direct. What it means is that you can move from judgment and certainty into discernment and curiosity, and you can then have a dialogue that's civil around shifting from position to shared interest. And the language we pick is very important. Now, I mean, I sit here and I think about all that's happening, and there's so many times where I feel very angry. But if I showed up angry in my work, I wouldn't be doing a service to myself or to anyone else. And so our work is to do our inner work so that we can hold and create containers. These containers are not safe spaces. And here's why I say that. We often talk in our work, we want to create a safe space. It doesn't matter whether that's what we want to do, because many people in these conversations don't feel safe. What we are trying to do and endeavor to do is create brave spaces for people to be courageous, despite the fact that they feel vulnerable and afraid. And if we hold a brave space container properly, then people can get angry, they can get emotional, and it's okay. Now, all of that is a corollary, and the companion activity to that is wise action, based on mindful awareness and compassion. Anybody that's heard me speak before has heard me talk about this quote that I heard, that I read, that was in a blog post that Jeff Weiner wrote, who's the former CEO of LinkedIn. And he was talking to his mentor, Fred Kaufman, who is very active in the conscious business community. And he said that wisdom without compassion, well, compassion without wisdom is folly. Wisdom without compassion is ruthlessness. So capitalism, in and of itself, we're looking at expanding that definition to all stakeholders. So if you look at the conscious capitalism movement, you look at how the demand for purpose has grown, hundreds of percentage points over the last few years. The end goal shouldn't just be profit. It should be making the world a better place while providing a good service. So I don't believe that we have to get rid of capitalism, although there's plenty of room to argue that we should. But I do think that there is a way to redefine what we mean by what's the outcome and the purpose of capitalism. We're always redefining things. I do think that we have to be very careful that we're not just repackaging, as you say, Denise, that all of a sudden capitalism is a nicer termed word that actually is doing the same thing. And that's where we hold each other accountable. And as leaders, when we move into our organizations, we have to have that courage and that moral courage to say, this is a lived value that is not in alignment with who we are. And these are the steps we need to take. Let's co-create that together. And that's why I made the point of lived values, because many organizations have values on a plaque, on a wall, on the intranet site of their HR portal. Those are spoken, but they may not be what's lived. And there needs to be a reconciling and an alignment of what is lived and what we're actually doing. So inviting in the conversation, setting a brave container, doing your work so when you show up and you hold that container, you can allow for that discourse to happen and for the discernment and curiosity to arise as we start to transform, not just change, what the new reality needs to be. So I think that was a long way of answering the question, but it's a good question. It's a really good question. And it's a hard one because this work is simple, but not easy.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Denise said, wow, wonderful, amazing. Danielle asks, in a time where we are suffering continuous losses of the results of our activated moral courage, how can we heal between blows as we stand for justice, safety, and health of our organizations and community? How do we show up strong and present and not weakened and fearful by each impact each day?
Yeah, I thank you, Danielle, for this question. And it's one that we all struggle with, because to be courageous and to have moral courage, sometimes we're standing alone. And that's why it's really important for us to establish and create networks, support communities, for us to be able to lean in and do this work, because many times we may be the first leading the way. We may be the visionary, the trailblazer, the early adopter. And that's a lonely place to be when it comes to situations and conditions of equity and social justice and racial justice and other things that create toxicity and fracture in our communities. So making sure that you have support and trying to find that allyship within your organization. The other thing is that context matters. And so all of us make that sort of assessment about, is it really safe? What is the real consequence of me doing this? And it may be that the real consequence is I lose my job, and I can't afford to lose my job. And so we have to broker and figure out, what is it that I can do that honors what is important to me? So I'm living my values. How ready is this organization and this community to hear these pieces? Now, we all feel there's an urgency for shift and transformation, but remember, we can't force it overnight. So as we meet people where they're at, We have to figure out what are the pieces, doses, levels of intensity, and bits of information that they're ready for, and then ready for next and next. And as we do that, that might be the approach we have, creating support for ourselves that is outside of ourselves. Then the support within ourselves, how to cultivate our resilience. I am a firm believer that meditation is helpful, and sort of being in nature, being around things that give you joy and help you be able to continue to see the good, to help you replenish yourself. Because without that, we start to give from an empty well. We start to work on exhaustion and fumes and depletion, and that is never sustainable.
Oh, Michelle, beautiful. Thank you so very much for your wisdom, compassion, and your time. So that wraps up our hour. And thank you, Michelle, again for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, who joined the call, for your engagement. And our next session is Tuesday, October 6th, with Martel Catalano. Please keep checking garrisoninstitute.org for updated listings of future sessions, and to view the recording of this webinar and others. Again, we provide these sessions free of charge. So if you would like to support this effort, please consider making a donation at garrisoninstitute.org. May everyone be happy, healthy, and safe.